Markell White, plaintiff's witness sworn. Please state your name for the record and Markell White. Good morning, Mr. White. Good morning. Mr. White, I noticed by your attire that you are currently in custody. Yes, sir. And are you in custody because you entered a guilty plea in this case? Yes, sir. Did you plead guilty to a RICO conspiracy? Yes, sir, I did. Your Honor, I object to the form of the question. I don't believe that's why he's in custody. I think the court ordered him in custody. Overruled. Mr. White, over the course of your life, have you been associated with a gang? Yes, sir, I have. Which gang is that? Gangster Disciples. Have you been a member of the gang? Yes, sir. Mr. White, how old were you when you joined the Gangster Disciples? Around 12 or 13, maybe. And where did you grow up? St. Louis and Macon. And where did you become a member of the Gangster Disciples? In St. Louis. And do you remember how you were initiated into the gang? Yes, sir. And please tell the jury how you were initiated. It was called line of fire. 6 guys would get in, 3 on each side, and basically we had to fight our way through. And so you did this at 12 years old? Yes, sir. And how old were the guys who were on the side of the line of fire? Anywhere from 16 to 25 years old. So they were older than you? Yes, sir. Was it a real fight or was it a play fight? It was a real fight. And do you know the point of that initiation? To prove how tough you were. Now, was being tough, was that a requirement for the Gangster Disciples? Yes, sir. Back then it was. Mr. White, why did you join the Gangster Disciples? Objection. Relevance. Overruled. Well, the guys in my neighborhood, they were kind of like protection, maybe, from the other older guys. There was a lot of stuff going on in my neighborhood back then. Sometimes they would help out with money, give me money and stuff like that. So I kind of drifted toward it. So you joined at around age 12 or 13? Yes, sir. In St. Louis? Yes, sir. And I believe you mentioned a second ago that you spent part of your childhood in Macon? Yes, sir. And do you remember how old you were when you moved to Macon? Between 13 and 14. And once you moved to Macon, did you become active with the Gangster Disciples in Macon? Yeah, the few that were there, yes. Mr. White, are you familiar with the term deck? Yes, sir. And what does deck mean? A city of guys that sort of formed a group of Gangster Disciples that's in that city. So a deck is a Gangster Disciples term? Yes, sir. Are you familiar with the term count? Yes, sir. And Mr. White, what is a count? Basically the same thing. Now, did you participate in a deck or a count while you were in St. Louis? No, sir. Did you participate in a deck or a count after you moved to Macon? Yes, sir. Are you familiar with the term plugged in? Yes, sir. And what does plugged in mean? It means that you're an official member. And does that apply to a city of Gangster Disciples? Yes, sir, it does. Now, when you moved to Macon, were the Gangster Disciples in Macon plugged in? Not at that time. And early on, you mentioned that you joined the Gangster Disciples at age 12 or 13. Did you learn some of the rules of the gang? Yes, sir, I did. Mr. White, what's the number 1 rule? Silence and secrecy. And are you breaking that rule by testifying today? Yes, sir, I am. Are you nervous about testifying today? Objection. Relevance. Overruled. Yes, sir, I am. Mr. White, why are you nervous about testifying today? Objection. Relevance. Overruled. I kind of know what comes behind me testifying. It can go bad on my behalf. Are those possible consequences why you're nervous this morning? Yes, sir. You mentioned a few seconds ago that the Macon Gangster Disciples were not plugged in. Is that right? No, sir. Not when I came in Macon, they weren't. And did there come a time when the Macon Gangster Disciples did plug in? Yes, sir. Do you remember approximately when this was? Maybe early 2013. Now, just prior to that, early 2013, before the Macon GDs plugged in, who was leading the GDs in Macon? I was. And please tell the jury how you all came to that decision to plug in. Well, this guy named KK contacted me. Your Honor, I'm going to object to hearsay at this point in time. Overruled. Co-conspirator. This guy named KK contacted me. And how did he contact you? On Facebook. And was Facebook a common way that Gangster Disciples communicated? Yes, sir, it was. And so he reached out to you around early 2013? Yes, sir. And he explained to me that it was called a plugger that was on Facebook. It was like the thing, like the end of a cord going into a plug, and it was called a plugger, and it meant you plug in, plug out. And he kind of explained to me what it meant. And he told us that either we was going to have to plug in or plug out. So I arranged a meeting with him. I went and met with him, and he told me that I had to later on go meet with Spike Walton. Let me ask you a couple of questions. Now, when KK, he's a gangster disciple? Yes, sir. Objection, leading, overruled. Did he have a position of authority? Yes, sir. Do you know his position of authority? Yes. He was the chief enforcer of the state. So he had a statewide office? Yes, sir. And when he reached out to you, did the Macon Gangster Disciples have any interest in plugging in? Yes, the three of us, not all of us. And why did the people who do not want to plug in not want to do it? Your Honor, I'm going to object hearsay if it's outside of the scope of this agreement that's part of this indictment. Overruled. Co-conspirator. Well, we kind of had our own thing going on, like we had been for years on top of years. So I kind of took it upon myself to tell Vert and a couple other guys that it was kind of in our best interest to plug in because of two things. I didn't want a war, and I wanted to be official. So those are basically the reasons. Mr. White, I'm going to hand you what I've marked as Government's Exhibits 521 and 522. Take a look at Government's 521 and 522. Do you recognize those items? Yes, sir. And what's in 521? Me and Vert and Tom. And in 522? Me and Vert and Tom. Your Honor, the United States moves for admission into evidence Government's Exhibits 521 and 522. Your Honor, those items 521 and 522, from what I understand, are Facebook records, and they've not been authorized and authenticated at this point in time. So I would ask that you provisionally not allow their admission until such time as Rule 901 has been compiled with. Overruled. Are those photographs Mr. Buchanan? That's correct, Your Honor. Overruled. Ms. Etienne, if I can have 521, please. Mr. White, take a look at 521. And who's on the left? Vert. And who's in the middle? I am. And who's on the right? Tom. Mr. White, is there significance to the number 74 to the Gangster Disciples? Yes, sir, there is. And please tell the jury that significance. It's a symbol of being a Gangster Disciple, GD. Those numbers stand for GD. G is the 7th letter of the alphabet? Yes, sir. D is the 4th? Yes, sir. Mr. White, are you familiar with the term standing on your 6? Yes, sir. Please tell the jury what that means. In other words, you making your body like a 6-pointed star, and that's basically it. Is a person on the right standing on their 6? No. Not quite? No. After Spike plugged in the Macon Gangster Disciples, did you all learn about the current structure? Yes, sir. And who told you about the structure? KK started, and Spike kind of took over and explained everything to us. Was there anything written down about the structure? Yes, leadership and dues and mainly everything that went on. And did the becoming a part of this statewide structure, did it give Macon some requirements? Yes, we had to pay dues and we had to attend meetings, report incidents, stuff like that. And were there meetings beyond just the Macon Gangster Disciples? Yes, there was. Were there statewide meetings? Yes, sir. And was Macon required to send representatives to those statewide meetings? Yes, sir, there was. 6 people. And you've mentioned that you had to pay dues. Did you have to pay dues in Macon? Both. So, and then you had to pay statewide dues as well? Yes, sir, both. Miss Etienne, if I can have Government's Exhibit 487. Mr. White, who is in Government's 487? Smurf. Do you know what position he had? He was part of the hate committee. We'll talk about the hate committee in a few minutes. Ms. Etienne, if I can have Government's 492. And who is in 492? Izzy. And is this the person you said came down with Spike to the meeting to plug in Macon? Yes, sir. Ms. Etienne, 486, please. Mr. White, who's in Government's 486? KK. And is this, I believe you said, was he the chief enforcer? Yes, sir, he was. Did he come down to that meeting in Macon to plug Macon in? Yes, sir. 485, Ms. Etienne. Mr. White, who's in Government's 485? Spike. And he was the governor at the time? Yes, sir, he was. And he came down to plug Macon in? Yes, sir. Mr. White, during the course of your time in the Gangster Disciples, have you ever heard from other Gangster Disciples that there are law enforcement members who are Gangster Disciples? Yes, sir. I heard it before. Ms. Etienne, if I can have Government 702, please. Mr. White, during your time as a Gangster Disciple, did you have the opportunity to speak to Mr. Clayton, or KK, on the phone? Yes, sir. And I believe you just testified that you heard from other Gangster Disciples that there were Gangster Disciples within law enforcement. Yes, sir, there was. There's a notebook in front of you that has some transcripts in it, a white notebook. Okay. If you turn to the one that's tabbed 702. Okay. Ms. Etienne, if we can have 702. Let me ask you about a couple of things on this transcript, Mr. White. Okay. First of all, do you know that one of those speakers to be Mr. Clayton? Yes, sir, I do. Now, he says, I got GD policies and everything, folks. Does the term folks have any meaning to the Gangster Disciples? Yes, it's basically the same as saying a GD. And Mr. Clayton then continues, GD throwing up rakes and everything. Does rakes have any significance to the Gangster Disciples? Pitchforks. Is that a symbol of the Gangster Disciples? Yes, sir. And is that a symbol that you can make with your hands? Yes, sir. Do you know what you said Mr. Clayton's position was, the chief of enforcement? Yes, sir. Now, was the hate committee involved in enforcement? Yes, sir, they were. And what you know about the hate committee, roughly, what are the ages of those folks? Are they young guys or older guys? Basically, all of them are young, the ones I knew. And as an enforcement arm, with Mr. Clayton being the chief enforcer of the state, would they have reported to him in the chain of command? Yes, sir, they would. And do you know whether or not there was a point at which several members of the hate committee were arrested? Yes, sir. I remember reading it in the paper. Mr. White, I'm going to hand you what I've marked as Government's Exhibit 107-0A13. What's the number, please? 107. 107. Thank you. Mr. White, back in 2013, when Macon was deciding whether or not to plug in, were you involved in that decision? Yes, sir. And at that time, in making that decision, did you view any videos that the Gangster Disciples were making? Yes, sir, I did. And did you view videos that the Gangster Disciples were making toward Rick Ross? The rapper Rick Ross? Yes, the rapper Rick Ross. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. I remember seeing them. Was there a video made by the Gangster Disciples about Rick Ross in Georgia? Yes, sir, there was. And do you remember who sort of was the face of that video? KK was. And you've had an opportunity to view that video? Yes, sir, I did. Your Honor, the United States moves into evidence Government's Exhibit 107-0A13. Objection on Rule 901. It's admitted over objection. Thank you, Your Honor. Ms. Etienne, if we can have 107, please. Mr. White, the person who was speaking in that video, was that Mr. Clayton? Yeah, it was KK. And that's the person who reached out initially to you about Macon plugging in? Objection. Leading. Overruled. Yes, sir. Now, did you see this video before Macon plugged in? Yes, sir. And what effect did this have on your decision for Macon to plug in? Kind of made me want to plug in more. And why is that? Mainly seeing it with what kind of power they really had. And I really didn't know they had that many people behind them. Stuff like that. Now, in the video, do you see people throwing up the rakes? Yes, sir. Mr. White, if you will turn in that book to tab 710, please. Okay. Now, during your time as a leader in Macon, did you have the opportunity to speak with Mr. Alonzo Walton or Spike Walton on the phone? Yes, sir, I did. Do you recognize his voice? Yes, sir. And Mr. White, did you ever learn from any of the Gangster Disciples whether or not anything ever happened as a result of those videos directed at Rick Ross? From my understanding, he ended up paying like $3 million. The initial payment was supposed to have been $6 million, but I think they worked it out to like $3 million. Ms. Etienne, if we can have 710, please. Excuse me, Mr. Buchanan. Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to take our morning break at this time. During the break, remember my instructions to you not to discuss the case with anyone, not to allow anyone to discuss the case in your presence. We're ready for the jury. All right, Mr. Buchanan. Thank you, Your Honor. Mr. White, before we took our morning break, we had viewed a Rick Ross video. Do you remember that? Yes, sir. I would ask you to turn to tab 710 in the transcript notebook that you have in front of you. And we talked about whether or not Rick Ross paid any money to the Gangster Disciples. Do you remember that? Yes, sir. Ms. Etienne, if we can have government 710, please. Let me ask you about some terms in this transcript, Mr. White. The unidentifiable male says he talked to Is. Are you familiar with Is? Yes, sir. And who is Is? I can't pronounce his real name. Can you give it a shot? Mangwire, something like that. You ever met him? Yes, sir. And is he a gangster disciple? Yes, sir. And did he have a position of authority? He was assistant governor, then later on the gov. I show you what I've marked as Government's Exhibit 479, what's been entered into evidence as Government's 479. And who is that, Mr. White? Is. And a little bit down in that paragraph, the unidentifiable person says that he believes, I believe in the vision of the old man. Who is the old man? Larry Hoover. And what is the vision of the old man? What is that a reference to? The laws and policies that we follow. Are you familiar with the term PML? Yes, sir. What does that mean? Plenty much love. Is that a Gangster Disciples term? Yes, sir. On the next page, Mr. White, Mr. Walton talks about something going up top. Do you know what that term means? Chicago. And specifically, what about Chicago? From what I got out of it, like the money got sent up top to Chicago. Would that be Gangster Disciples leadership in Chicago? Yes, sir. And on the next page, Mr. Walton references Mama Hoover and Little Larry. Do you know who those folks are? Yes, sir. And who's Mama Hoover? Larry Hoover's wife. And who is Little Larry? His son. Mr. White, you testified earlier that you joined the Gangster Disciples when you were 12 or 13 years old? Yes, sir. How old are you now, Mr. White? 47. Well, I'm 46, fixing to be 47. So, roughly 30 years you've been a member of this organization. Yes, sir. And you were indicted in this case and you pled guilty? Yes, sir. And you pled guilty to RICO conspiracy? Yes, sir. Do you have a plea agreement with the United States? Yes, sir. I hand you what I've marked as Government's Exhibit 443. Mr. White, what is Government's Exhibit 443? I'm sorry? What is Government's Exhibit 443? No other agreement. It says no other agreements on top. Look in the front. Is that your plea agreement? Okay. Guilty plea agreement. Guilty plea and plea agreement. On page 12, is your signature there? Yes, sir, it is. Your Honor, the United States moves into evidence Exhibit 443. It's admitted without objection. Mr. White, did you plead guilty because you are guilty? Yes, sir, I am. And before you pled guilty, did you begin cooperating in this case? Yes, sir. You sat down with the agents and talked about objection, leading, overruled. Did you sit down with the agents and tell them what you've done? Yes, sir. Did you sit down with the agents and tell them what other people have done? Yes, sir. Are you testifying today because ultimately you want your sentence reduced? Yes, sir. Have I or anybody else with the government made you any promises about what your sentence will be? No, sir. And in the end, who decides what your sentence will be? The judge. And will your sentence be reduced if you take that stand and lie? No, sir. Objection, leading, overruled. No, sir, it will not. Earlier, I showed you, Miss Etienne, if I can have the government's 521, please. Do you remember this picture, Mr. White? Yes, sir. Yes, sir, I do. Ms. Etienne, 522, please. Your Honor, I'm going to make an additional objection to those exhibits based on chain of custody. Chain of custody is not required for a picture, Mr. Byrne. Overruled. Mr. White, what's in 522? Myself, Tom, and Bert. So it's just the backside of the picture we saw in 521? Yes, sir. What's the emblem below your names on the back of those sweatshirts? It's a 6-point star. Is that a Gangster Disciples symbol? Yes, sir. Earlier, you testified that you didn't want a war, and that was partially why you plugged in? Yes, sir. Now, were there any benefits to plugging in? I guess being able to reach out to people if you need them, like a lot of stuff going on in Macon, and sometimes it get out of hand in the streets. What do you mean by that? Like wars, physical fighting, among other things. And sometimes it's just best to have a lot of people on your side. So you wanted a lot of people to support you if things turned violent? Yes. Objection, leading, overruled. Yes, sir, I did. Mr. White, are you familiar with the term lanes? Yes, sir. And tell the jury, what's a lane? It's just whatever you're involved in. We use it like different people have different lanes, and it's just a terminology to stay in whatever your lane is. Is the term lanes used for criminal activity? Yes. And what was your lane? It used to be a drug dealer, mainly defrauding on gambling machines, mainly. And did plugging in introduce you to other lanes? If I wanted to, yeah. Now, as a gangster disciple, if you wanted to learn about another lane, was there a way for you to do that? Yes, sir, there were. And how would you do that? If someone was from another city or state or whatever, and I want to contact them and find out exactly what they were into, I could. It wouldn't be an issue. Through the Gangster Disciples, could you learn of a new drug connection? Yeah, easily. You mentioned a second ago that you defrauded gambling machines? Yes, sir. And would you travel around to do that? State to state, city to city? Yes, sir, I would. When you went to a different state, were you required as a gangster disciple to check in with the gangster disciples in that state? Yes, sir, every time. And how would you do that? I would make a call back to Atlanta and get the number of whoever was over the state that I was going to, and I would call them. And then we would go down the chain of what city I was going to be in and narrow it down. I would meet up with the first C of that city along with security, and we would go from there. So you would reach up to your governor of your state leadership? Yes, sir. And your state leadership, would your state leadership reach out to the other state's leadership? They would give me the number, and I would call them. 9 out of 10 times, I had already met them before anyway. So I would just call them and remind them who I was and told them I was coming, and we would just go from there. And why would you do this, Mr. White? For security purposes. There was a big issue about a gangster disciple going to other cities and other states without tapping in, what they call tapping in. Someone ended up getting hurt. One of the gangster disciples ended up getting hurt, and they just kind of made it a rule that it was a thing we had to. Now, did this tapping in have anything to do with rival gangs? Once it did, yeah. And would you want to know when you went into a new city whether or not that was a rival gang's neighborhood? Yes, sir, I would. Ms. Etienne, if we could have government's 754, please. Mr. White, turn to 754 in that notebook. Now, Mr. White, are you familiar with a person who went by YT? TY? TY, I'm sorry. Yes, sir. Ms. Etienne, if we can play that call. Mr. White, is TY a gangster disciple? Yes, sir. And around lines 14 and 15, first of all, this is you talking. Is that right? Yes, sir, it is. You say, I need some S, though. What is S? Security. And was it a common practice if you needed some protection from other gangster disciples, could you call another gangster disciple and get it? Yes, sir, you could. And this is what you're doing right now at this call to TY? Yes, sir. And you know that the store is right in a Crip neighborhood. Why was that of concern? Safety for myself. It's the store where the Crips sell drugs out of. So there was a lot of them at that store at that time, and it's a well-known Crip area. So I didn't have a gun. So I wanted to feel protected, so I called my friend. This was in 2014. What position did you hold? I was a regent of the state at the time. So you had been elevated from your first C of Macon? Yes, sir, I had. Now, was TY under you? Yes, sir. And was TY, given that you were a leader, was he obligated to provide you with some security? Yes, sir, he had to. So when you called TY for some security, you would get it? Yes, sir. Because you were the leader? Yes, sir, I was. And you mentioned to TY that you probably need someone with a strap. What's a strap, Mr. White? A gun. And did TY agree to show up with a gun? Yes, sir, he did. A second ago, we were talking about lanes and reaching out to others to learn their lanes. Okay. If you reached out to a gangster disciple about a lane, would you trust them on that? Yes, sir, I would. And did other gangster disciples, reach out to you about lanes and criminal activity? Yes, sir. Given that you were involved in defrauding machines, did anyone ever reach out to you about fraud? A few did, yes. Do you remember anyone in particular who reached out to you about fraud? Mainly in other states. They would call me back and kind of help me maneuver through the city and tell me to come back. They would call me and let me know what kind of machines they had and what I needed to do with it and stuff like that. In addition to the machines, did you ever get involved in any other fraud schemes? Yes. Please tell the jury what types of other fraud you got involved in. Credit card scamming, checks. Who got you involved in the checks? I kind of brought it, well, I wouldn't say I brought it to Atlanta, but I kind of brought it around the guys at the Gangster Disciples in Atlanta. I've been dealing with checks mainly all my life. Did you ever deal with any checks with Is? Yes, sir. And tell the jury how that happened. Well, he had 2 checks, one for $30,000 and I think the other for like 10. But the amount was too big for the people I usually deal with to cash the checks. So I ended up giving them back to him and told him he had to get some with a lesser amount because the amount that he had was too big. We talked a little bit about, you mentioned earlier that you've been involved in some drug dealing. Yes, sir. Would you take a look in that tab book at 746? Mr. White, I'm going to show you what's been entered into evidence as Government's Exhibit 478. Ms. Etienne, if I can have 478. Mr. White, who's in Government's 478? It looks like Shake. He looks kind of different. Who is Shake? Shantae Craig. Is he a gangster disciple? Yes, sir. Have you had an opportunity to speak with Shake on the phone before? Yes, sir, I did. Have you met him in person? Yes, sir. What was his position? He was a board member. Now, where does board member fit in relation to you as a regent for a state? It's a lot higher. As a regent, who was right above you? Spike. And what position did Spike hold? The governor of the state. And who was above Spike as the governor of the state? A board member. So Shake was a couple of levels higher than you? Yes, sir. But you had an opportunity to meet him? Yes, sir, I did. Do you know what Shake's lane was? Drugs, mainly. Ms. Etienne, if we can play 746, please. Mr. White, are you familiar with the term Roxy's? Yes, sir. What are Roxy's? Prescription pills. Did you ever deal in fake Roxy's? Yes, sir, I did. Did you make them? Yes, sir. And with whom did you make the fake Roxy's? Me and Johnny. Johnny Chapel? Yes, sir. Another gangster disciple? Yes, sir. Ms. Etienne, if we can go to 748, please. Mr. White, if you will turn to 748. Mr. White, was it common for gangster disciples to refer to each other as G? Very common. And you said you had the opportunity to speak with Shantae Craig on the phone. Yes, sir. Ms. Etienne, 748, please. Mr. White, this call is about apparently some blue pills. Does that sound familiar? Yes, sir. And what are those blue pills? Roxy's. And were you and Mr. Craig working on dealing some Roxy's? Yeah, we had planned on it. You mentioned you met Shantae Craig in person. Yes, sir, I did. Do you remember where you all met? The first time, it was over at Spike's house. The second time, it was at a friend of mine's club. And the third time was at a house that he had in Conyers. Is Conyers in the Atlanta metro area? Yes, sir. Spike's house, is that in Atlanta? Yes, sir. And the club that was operated by a friend of yours, was that in Atlanta too? Yes, sir. Mr. White, we talked about lanes and learning other people's lanes and connecting people. Did you ever put any people in touch for a drug transaction? Yes, sir, I have. Please tell the jury about that. A friend of mine came from Macon, and he wanted a half a pound of weed. And I introduced him to one of the Gangster Disciple guys in Atlanta, and they went on and did their business or whatever. By that time, I was out of the drug game, so I didn't stick around and find out. But later on, I called and made sure everything had went okay, and he said everything had went okay. Within that Gangster Disciples context, you just made the connection? Yes, sir. I was just doing a friend a favor. We talked a second ago about fake Roxy's. You mentioned that you had made some? Yes, sir. Did you sell them? A few of them. I mainly gave them away. A lot of them away. But yeah, I sold a few. And the ones that you sold, did you still hope to make some money off of them? Yes, sir. And the fake ones that you sold, your plan, would the buyers know that they were fake? No, they didn't. Well, some of them. They ultimately found out they were fake? Yeah. I mean, some of them knew. Some of them didn't know. But it was still your goal to make some money off of them? Oh, yes, sir. Now, we mentioned after Macon was originally plugged in, you were living in Macon at the time, right? Yes, sir. You were the first C of Macon? Yes, sir. I was staying in Atlanta when Macon first got plugged in. So you were up in Atlanta? Yeah. And what part of Atlanta did you live in? The east side, on DeKalb County side. Mr. White, when you also mentioned that you became a regent. Yes, sir, I did. So you went from First C of Macon to Regent for Georgia? Yes, sir. And when you became the Regent and you were no longer the First C in Macon, who took your place? Vert did. Ms. Etienne, if you can... Mr. White, turn to tab 753. Ms. Etienne, if we can have 753, please. Mr. White, you mentioned when you would travel to different cities, you would check in with the Gangster Disciples in that city? Yes, sir. I think you called it tapping in? Yes, sir. Was it common or expected for Gangster Disciples, when they arrived at a new place, to get in touch with the leadership? Yes, sir. Always. Ms. Etienne, 753, please. Now, Mr. White, let's talk a little bit about this call. Is this an example of someone, a Gangster Disciple, getting in touch with you to let him know that he's in town? Objection, Your Honor. Leading. Overruled. No, sir. And what is this an example of? There was someone getting out of jail or either moving to the city, and they want to be plugged in with the city that they were going to be staying at. And that brings up a good point. Is there a Gangster Disciple structure within the prison system as well? Yes, sir, it is. Were you familiar with that structure? Yes, sir. Have you been active as a Gangster Disciple while you've been incarcerated? Yes, sir. Are there positions of authority for Gangster Disciples within the prison system? Yes, sir. Did you hold a position while you were in prison? Yeah, a couple. What were those positions that you held while you were in prison? Mainly the IC. What's the IC? The unit coordinator. So, Mr. Pig calls you and he says he was told to get in touch with you. Is that common? Yes, sir. And why would he have gotten in touch with you? Objection, Your Honor. That would be speculation. Overruled. Because mainly when people speak of Macon, it's just the names that they go on to call when someone's saying they're trying to plug into Macon. I guess my name would be a first choice name that people would call. Because you had been a long-time Gangster Disciple leader in Macon? Yes. Objection. Leading. Overruled. And you mentioned to Pig that Vert is the first. What does that mean? The first C. The spot I had before I left. And would the first C, the first coordinator, need to know about someone coming out of prison or coming into his town? Yeah, they would have had to know. And so based on this call, did you reach out to Vert? Yes, sir, I did. So you made that connection? Yes, sir. And so we're clear, when you talked about being active as the institutional coordinator, that was when you were incarcerated before this case, right? Yeah, like 20 years ago, or a little over 20 years ago. You finished this call on the third page by saying love. Is that greeting or goodbye special in the Gangster Disciples? It's kind of short for PML we went over earlier. It's just short for PML, basically. Just saying love. Instead of plenty much love, just love. But that's a goodbye that the Gangster Disciples frequently use? Yes. Mr. White, if you could flip backward a little bit to 749, please. When a member or a person checks in with Gangster Disciples leadership and says they want to plug in, do the Gangster Disciples conduct any type of background check or anything to learn about that person? Yes, sir, they do. And over your time within the gang, have you seen examples where people have switched from one gang to another? Yes, sir. Ms. Etienne, if we can have 749, please. Let me ask you about some of the parts of this call. Are you familiar with this call? Yes, sir. And this is you speaking? Yes, sir, it is. Now, Mr. Mathis says, should I try to call Vert? Now, why would he have tried to call Vert before he called you? To call Vert would refer that I was the regent of the state at that time, and he couldn't get to me. So I guess he was just calling me on just a friendly level. Vert, who he tried to get in touch with, I guess he had no luck getting in touch with him. That's why on the second page he says, I ain't trying to go over Vert's head. Is that why? Because Vert was under you at the time? Objection, leading. Overruled. Yes, sir. Now, he also says that, on that page, he says, that's when I had my POA. What's POA short for? Position of authority. In the Gangster Disciples, is it the responsibility of the people with the POAs to conduct these type of background checks? Yes, sir. And does it sound like In this call, Mr. Mathis is conducting a background check on this person who is now claiming to be a GD. Objection, Your Honor. That is leading and it also calls for speculation. Overruled. Yes, sir. Mr. White, at the bottom of the first page, line 25, Mathis says something about breaking silence on Facebook, talking about GD business. Do you know what that's in reference to? I don't remember the incident that happened, but I know what he's talking about in words. Yeah. What is silence? We're not supposed to be talking to any other gang about GD business or anything that go along with GD. He was saying, basically, that he was just running his mouth, telling everything, stuff like that. Mr. White, if you can flip over to 750. Mr. White, did you speak with Vert Wall on the phone? At which time? During the course of the time before you were arrested, did you speak on the phone with him? Yes, sir, I did. Ms. Etienne, if we can have 750. Mr. White, will you tell the jury what this call is about? Dues. Gangster Disciple dues? Yes, sir. So at the time, you were a regent? Yes, sir. And at the time, do you remember Mr. Wall's position? First C of Macon. So he was reporting to a superior about dues. Well, he was supposed to give it to Johnny, and I just was reminding him that Macon hadn't paid. I had spoke to him earlier about it, and he was really just giving it to me. But he was supposed to have been got with Johnny on it. Okay. And what was Johnny's position? The treasurer of the state. And if you will flip over to 751. Mr. White, there's an exchange between you and Mr. Wall, lines 15 through 18. And Mr. Wall says, people are tired of holding back. Do you see that part? Yes, sir. Do you know what that's in reference to? I guess being. Objection, Your Honor. I guess calls for speculation. Overruled. The term that I get from it is, like, when people are being goody two-shoe and they just want to at least be took off some time. And is this in reference to Gangster Disciples activity? Yes, sir. And in line 19, he says, I did it for this situation. Do you know what that's about? Or do you remember what that's about? Yeah, I think they got into a fight or something. I can't remember exactly what the situation were, but I think it was a fight they got into. Objection, Your Honor. That would be speculation. Overruled. He's a participant in the call. He can talk about what it's about. Well, he said he didn't remember, Your Honor. Don't argue with me, Mr. Byrne. Go ahead, Mr. Buchanan. Did you tell the FBI that you were not a regent? I think I did. I don't recall. But I remember them asking me a bunch of questions, some similar to that, and I could have said that. Is that the truth or a lie? That was a lie. I was a regent. Did you tell the agents, FBI agents on May the 4th, that you were associated but not affiliated with the Gangster Disciples? Yes, sir. Was that the truth or a lie? That was true. Did you tell the agents that you had not attended any Gangster Disciple sponsored functions to include the Nines? In the last couple of years, yes. Is that what you told? Did you tell the FBI agents that that was within the last couple of years? Or did you just say since your release from prison? I don't remember. Did you tell the FBI agents back on May the 4th that you did not pay dues? Yes. Is that true or a lie? That's true. When you were referring to Mr. Wall, my client, did you tell the FBI agents that you did not know if Mr. Wall was affiliated with any particular gang while he lived in Macon? No. You never said that? No. When you were talking to the FBI agents on May the 4th in regard to the incident at a Wings Cafe, did you tell them that you believe that the fight was related to an incident that occurred about 5 or 6 years ago? Yes, I think I did. I mean, I don't even remember them asking me about that on May the 4th. I think that was a different time. Now, you told the jury that you wanted to set the record straight when you went to meet with the agents on May the 4th, correct? Yes. But nevertheless, you admit today that you were lying to the agents too? Yes, sir, I did. Lies have been an important part of who you are. Isn't that true? Yes, it is. In fact, even your name has sometimes been a lie. Not intentionally. What? Not intentionally. That wasn't my fault. You have used an alias of Markell Dinner Taylor, haven't you? That's my real name. Then who is Markell White? It's my name as well. Would you like me to explain to you how it went? I would like to know how you have two names. Okay. My dad never signed my birth certificate when I was born. He was married to my mom. He was in the military, so I automatically adopted the name, White. I went to school up under White. I went to prison up under White. Everything under White. I got in prison. Decided to get my life on track. I went to go get my license, and they said it didn't have a record of White. So that's when Taylor became about. When you got your life straight, that was when you were still engaged in criminal acts, right? Yeah, you could say that, yeah. All right. So you got your life straight committing crimes, and you took on another name, didn't you? Nah, it wasn't like that. Wasn't your intention to try to misdirect people in law enforcement who may come in contact with you? I mean, it wasn't that because it's the same social security number. I mean, it's impossible to do that. Once the name is ran, it's going to say White as well. I'm going to switch gears from some of your past to talk about your connection to Wings Cafe for a little bit, okay? Okay. Now, there came a point in time that you came into a considerable amount of money. Isn't that fair to say? Yes. And we'll talk about how you came into that money in a little bit. But you did come into enough money that you were actually considering buying certain property, correct? Yes. And one of the properties that you were considering purchasing was Wings Cafe? No, I never considered. I had a club. I left the club life alone. I never considered buying Wings Cafe. Too much stuff had already happened there before the shooting. A couple people already got killed there before that. So you're saying that you made no effort to communicate with anybody about purchasing Wings Cafe before December 2014? No. Like I said, buying stuff out of Wings Cafe. Somebody had got killed and they had closed down. And I considered buying stuff out of Wings Cafe. The grill, stove, stuff like that. Because it was a bar, right? Yes. It was a nightclub? Yes, it was. It served alcohol? Yes. Food? Yes. There was some adult entertainment? At one time, yeah. Okay. And it was a club that was in a part of town that a lot of people visited, correct? Yes. People from all types of life, right? Yes, sir. You said you had gone to the Wings Cafe many times? No, once. You went one time? Once. And that's how you knew that there was going to be so much equipment there? I mean, it's a nightclub. Every nightclub has the same kind of equipment. Sir, I just want to ask you a couple more questions related to the event at Wings Cafe. Okay. Now, to your knowledge, the event that occurred at Wings Cafe, at least as it relates to the individuals who you've identified as members of Gangster Disciples, was not planned, was it? I don't know. I didn't find out until later on, so I really don't know. Well, you testified at another hearing, didn't you? Yes. In this room, is that right? Yes. And you were asked, one thing we do know is what happened that night. That is, Wings Cafe was not planned. Is that right? Do you remember that question? Yes. And your answer was, no, sir, it was not. Wasn't this your answer? I don't remember. At the time, yeah. Look at lines 1 through 3. I'll ask you again. What happened to your knowledge, at the Wings Cafe was not planned. Isn't that right? I guess not. It's not what? I said, I guess not planned. It was not planned, correct? Yes. And, in fact, as far as what you knew, what happened at the Wings Cafe on December 12th, 2014 was spur of the moment. Isn't that right? Yes. And as far as what you were told, what happened as far as the Wings Cafe as it relates to the persons who you've identified as members of the Gangster Disciples was done in self-defense? I don't know. I wasn't there. I don't know. What you understood? What you heard? Somewhat, yeah. After the fight. Yeah. It was justified? It was self-defense? Your Honor, I would object that calls for a legal conclusion. Rephrase your question. What you understood is that what happened was done because the other group had said or was shown something that caused members of the people you've identified as Gangster Disciples to shoot back? Yes. Lastly, I think you talked about Wings Cafe being a place for a lot of people to congregate, correct? Yes. I know you said you had only been there once, but you were familiar with Wings Cafe. Yes. And you knew that it was frequented by people of all different groups, correct? Yes. And people that weren't designated as being a member of one group or another, correct? Correct. Girlfriends came, right? Yes. Wives? Yes, sir. Friends? Yes. So now I want to talk about some of the conversations that the Department of Justice attorney asked you on your direct examination. If we could please all turn to Government's Exhibit 749T. Are you there, sir? Yes. And this is a conversation. Let me just ask you, have you come to learn that your phone was being spied on by government officials? Your Honor, I would object to the characterization of spying. Overruled. Before I was arrested or after? Yes, before your arrest. No. After your arrest, you found out that your phone was being tapped? Yes. And conversations that you were having during pretty much the summer of 2014 were being listened to by the agents of the Department of Justice and the FBI? Yes. And so this is an example of one of the calls that was listened to while you didn't know you were being listened to, right? Correct. And the substance of this call, 749, is about an individual who wants to join your group, correct? Yes. And what's different about this individual is that he actually has been a member of other groups, correct? Yes. So basically, he's been switching, as far as you know, switching from one group to another over a period of time. Yes. Now, that is something that was permitted. Isn't that true? Yes. So is there something in this well-talked about rule book about people changing teams? It's different for GDs. I mean, Crips and Bloods, they don't abide by the same laws and policies that we do. Well, I'm talking about this rule book that you've been asked about. You can change teams if you want, right? For a Gangster Disciple to change teams or for a Crip to change teams? I mean, I don't understand the question. Well, in this case, it's somebody that wanted to change onto your team. Yes. It sounds like it was okay? For certain people. Okay. You do a little background, a little research, right? Yes. Right? Yes. And then you can just change teams if you want? I mean, it may have been okay in Macon, but that don't necessarily mean it was okay in Atlanta. I mean, because, go ahead. Yeah, because, I mean, sometimes people just want to go off of, okay, that's my friend, so I'm going to let him get away with it, whatever. You know, certain situations. Right. Macon is different? Yeah. You can have friends in other groups, right? Yes. So there was not that kind of separation between one group and another in Macon, generally, right? It's according to which ones. That's why different groups, for instance, met at the Wings Cafe. True? Met? Okay. Or disappeared? All right. Let's talk about the next call, which is Government's Exhibit 750. And this is one of those calls that you didn't know was being recorded, right? Yes. And this is a call that you've testified that was between you and Mr. Wall, right? Yes. And looking at lines 14 and 15, according to the transcript, Mr. Wall says, I'm going up here to Marietta, misspelled, to check out a little security job. Do you see that? Yes. In fact, what you understood is that Mr. Wall had moved to Atlanta sometime in 2013 or early 2014. Is that right? Yeah, he was staying with me.